My name is Xalavier Nelson Jr. I've worked on about 100 games now in the last 8 years. I've been in the industry for 14 years, starting as a journalist and then becoming a game developer, going from becoming a game developer to running a studio as well as collaborating with other studios. And now what I do is I make a lot of cool games with a lot of cool people with the explicit objective of making games better, faster, cheaper, and healthier than the industry assumes is possible.
How did you get started in this journey? Like, how did you even know this is something you wanted to do, or something you even wanted to pursue?
Ever since I was a kid, I'm thankful that my parents are of the generation and the perspective that my dad was a gamer. So they understood games as an art form, as a career that someone could pursue. So when I was tiny and obsessed with Morrowind, and I was like, I want to be a beta tester. They're like, yeah, cool. Let's see if there's a way to make that happen. And when I was 12 and found out that games journalists get games for free, I was like, I want to be a games journalist. You get paid games, and then all you got to do is just write something about it. That's objectively the best job. I was homeschooled, so my mom was like, well, that's reading comprehension, that's essay writing. Yeah, go on ahead. And here I am now.
From your perspective, kind of being in it for however long you've been in it now, seeing the changes from when you first got in it to now, as sort of the technology and the industry sort of change, and just everything about it is kind of changing at this point. Sort of, how do you look at that transition from like where you started to kind of where you are now?
Gosh, wild thinking about how much has changed in 14 years. I think one of the biggest ones is scale and expectation. Games exists in the realm of miracles right now. There's no denying just the absolute power of the fact that we have crossplay. I remember when me and my friends would dream about crossplay or be like, well, we don't have the same platform. Guess this will never be possible. And now that that's become standardized and is a piece of our reality, it's the number of quiet miracles that exist in games is wild. Keyboard and mouse support, as well as gamepad support for pretty much every game that comes out now, is wild. Japanese games hitting the Western market at the same time as they hit Japan is wild. And the unacknowledged nature of all of these changes, even if you just go back to as far as the 360 generation, realize subtitles weren't standardized. Especially in the PS2 generation, most things didn't have subtitles. You can see how far we've come. That it's not being acknowledged. It's just taken as like, oh yeah, that's what a game is. And that work hasn't actually become easier. Crossplay, you don't get that for free with the vast majority of multiplayer systems. It's just more work that no one talks about. Subtitles is just more work that no one talks about, and that several game engines don't even have as a built-in feature. You're just building that stuff to hit the invisible standard. So I'm very grateful for where games is. Once again, it's so much better place for players. I think in a lot of ways it's better for developers. But I think one of the things that erodes our ability to talk about the industry and what it means to make a game is that we take for granted that each piece of a game is a choice, and that each piece of a game is explicit additional effort. If you're going to make a game on Steam and it's going to have achievements, someone has to name every achievement, put in a description, and put in an image. And you'd be surprised how often that takes already tight deadlines and makes it like, okay, coming up towards launch, oh shoot, we need to make achievements now. It's one more thing. It's the feather literally on top of the camel's back that breaks it.
Or I'm not sure a lot of people even think about it that way. But it's funny you bring up the crossplay, because it's sort of a big deal now. Like, just the entitlement of players, I guess you could say, these days. These games are expected to be bigger, better, faster, but people are not seeing everything that goes into it on the day-to-day, especially with all the layoffs that's happening, the constant change. Obviously, you've worked on games, but then you've also worked on a VR game. So you sort of know that spectrum, especially over 14 years working on a game that might have been for different platforms. Now VR sort of.
VR, mobile. I've been all over the place.
Yeah, what is that like? Like trying to sort of bridge all of those gaps because yes, it might be the same IP, but it might not be the same as far as playability or the way it is viewed on mobile as opposed to console or something like that. Like how do you sort of mold all those ideas? Like how does all that come together?
I think that one of the key pieces to making everything come together from that perspective is just a really deep understanding of your medium. Again, this is because even inside of our industry, we do take for granted so much of the day-to-day effort of what it will it be like to make this type of game. Um, I've worked on multiple VR games, and the just simple reality of the player can control their head. You cannot force their perspective the 99% of the time. That fundamentally alters the way you build a story. There are VR games that take advantage of that, and they tend to sell very, very, very well. And then there's VR games that, whether or not they sell well, don't take advantage of that. And there's a very marked difference between them. And it's not one of skill, it is one of recognition of the space you're playing in. So, yeah, well, mobile screens, also the fact that we're all getting older and text that's small is really, really tough to deal with, especially on a TV screen. And they're figuring out what is your font size, what is your font. All of that is a piece of, I think, becoming a more precise game developer. How do you look at how to solve a problem? The first of which is how you make a compelling game for your player. Build in a solution that is taking advantage of everything that every constraint, every helpful artistic constraint that your chosen platform has.
I really want to touch on this one because I love simulator games. The Space Warlord Organ Trading Simulator is really funny to me. How do, like, when you come up with ideas like that around that realm, and then you go from that to working on something like
El Paso Elsewhere, I Am Your Beast, definitely.
How do you mold that creativity to where you're still using that creativity, but obviously that is two totally different ways of looking at a game, point of view, all of that stuff. Like how do you sort of go about it when you're working through your creative workflow?
I think in each space that I've had the blessing to be able to walk into, one of the things that I've been glad to refine is that precision, right? When you're working on something quote unquote more mainstream or that has an established precedent. From the beginning at Strange Scaffold, I wanted people to be able to recognize a creative fingerprint and follow that. So even if we didn't make an action game next, even if it wasn't a genre that wasn't their thing, they would try our weird noir poker crime story starring adorable animals. They would try our Space Warlord Organ Trading Simulator after doing our throwback slow-mo third-person shooter tribute. So the creative process is usually very similar. We choose the constraints, we choose our time, we choose our budget, we align our vision towards that creative constraint, and we make as many decisions, and I make as many decisions around the holistic context of that game as possible. Space Warlord, one of the things that you talk about there is like, what do players mod? What do players not mod? What is, at what point of the game development process does modding come in to facilitate everything else that you want the project to do? There's all sorts of solutions and ideas that are enabled or disabled by virtue of your context. And we've really leaned in as a studio to say, yeah, if we're making a game in 9 months, we don't try to make a game in 18 months in half the time. We really build everything to work together towards that goal. So Space Warlord, some people are like, hey, I want a bigger emphasis on the stock market. And it's like, that's not this game. It's not a real-time stock ticker. It's okay to say what a game isn't so that you can really focus in and define all the things that the game is. And that focus is part of the reason that I think a lot of people end up falling in love with Strange Scaffold games, because they are focused. They are saying something specific. And in this time where games cost more to make than ever and take more time to make than ever and launch at more places than ever simultaneously, a lot of developers are terrified to not do something.
So they just try to do everything and hope that, whatever sticks, and if it doesn't.
Projects become so risky that they have to try to do everything, and in the process can end up satisfying no one or satisfying no one to an extraordinary degree. And inside the studio, I refer to this as a game-shaped object. It's a blob. It doesn't say anything. It doesn't make a statement of intent. It has a crafting system, has an XP bar. These things are in isolation totally fine. But when things get added as part of a checklist in order to make sure that people don't get angry with you, as opposed to working in with the rest of how the game works, it's a notable difference in perspective. So for one of our next games, it's a co-op kaiju horror cooking game starring monks in the roughly 13th century.
Okay, yeah, that's a lot.
And it's pulling on some influences like Phasmophobia and Lethal Company, and of course more things like The Name of the Rose and Pentiment. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we were doing as part of that game loop was having it so that players could earn currency, because you have to, right? You have to earn currency so you can buy things to make the next piece of the run easier or give you a new tool to deal with the frustration you just dealt with. So you're hyper focused on making sure that never happens to you again.
Right.
And one of the things I love about Strange Scaffold is I open up a conversation of saying, hey, this currency thing just isn't working philosophically. It isn't aligning with the rest of the game. Is everybody else feeling that way? And it turned out there were several people that were like, yeah, I'm not seeing how this fits in, particularly when the vendors you'd be buying from are your fellow monks. If we are depicting a positive religious community united by satisfying this deeply weird goal of cooking for kaijus in order to avoid the apocalypse, then it wouldn't make sense for them to not give you something just because you had 1 point less than you were supposed to. And so what we changed that system to, and this is still a work in progress system and implementation, of course, but an example of Strange Scaffold problem solving is we made it so that the more currency you earn, the more things all the vendors will just give you the next year. So when you bring more back to your monastery, that means the things that they give you freely, they have even more of a supply to give you from. You give less, they'll still give to you freely. They'll just have less to give you. Mm-hmm. And leaning in, I'm really proud of how the entire team came together to lean into what this community is supposed to be and questioning this sacred part of a game loop and still satisfying that thing while making sure it lined up with the world that we were actually building.
You also touched on El Paso elsewhere, and I'm looking at a couple of other ones. I Am Your Beast. What is your artistic, inspiration, or where do you draw all of this? If anybody gets a chance to look at these, very visually appealing for sure.
Thank you.
And smooth. Where do you draw from when you're sort of putting all of your elements together as far as visually and things like that?
When I'm looking for inspiration for a project, I pull from everywhere. I pull from literature, I pull from games, I pull from music, I pull from walking around and experiencing life. I've had the opportunity to travel a lot of places, and sometimes I've traveled to a place and it's just stuck with me, or a piece of imagery or an idea it sparks ends up in a game. So even El Paso also itself was fundamentally inspired by, we arrived in El Paso, which has become my adoptive hometown. And I was so struck by the landscape in this place. It was, after being a military brat my entire life, it was the first place I'd been that felt like home, truly. And we set down stakes here. I looked around and I said, we were driving on one of the signature roads in town. It's known as Trans Mountain. And you're just winding through the Franklin Mountains that overlook the city as an easy route from east to west, because there's basically an east side and a west side of El Paso. And as we were driving along, this image struck me in my head of this guy driving a car through these same mountains late at night, streetlights cinematically passing overhead. He's driving slowly because he's got the body of a vampire in his trunk and he's going to burn it out here before anyone can find him. And I was like, I don't know who this guy is. I don't know his name, but there's a story there that I need to tell. And that ultimately, after several years, culminated in being the game that we eventually released, El Paso Elsewhere. So yeah, I take inspiration from everywhere. I am a sponge, I'm a recontextualizer, and I am happy to discuss all of those inspirations because I don't think you build something truly innovative without honoring your past.
Not all ideas are brand new ideas. They are just
A lot of brand new ideas are actually based on something else.
Purgatory Dungeoneer.
That's a game that we published. We didn't make that one.
Even just the different elements of the things that you've been a part of is just sort of all over, a melting pot of creativity. Very interesting. As far as technology goes, VR, AR, after a while, we just gonna be playing games, simulators, and all this different stuff. How do you sort of look at the future, like when you're looking at creating new ideas and projects? Like, are you looking to innovate as far as like, oh, I want to do this and be sort of, you know, one of the first in this space, whatever that might be? Because I mean, VR is still very young. People are in the space, but it's not really mainstream, I guess you could say. How do you sort of like, are you wanting to like lean into that? Because you know that, hey, here in the future, that is going to be mainstream. And that's not really a thing of question. It's just a win. So how do you look at, when you're looking at the future and looking at technology, how do you say, hey, okay, I'm going to lean more into this, or hey, I'm going to be nostalgic and maybe go back to this?
I'd say that the number one I think of, there's two things I think of for this. It's as we walk into the future, where is my brain going for how we continue to make games, right? I'd say the first thing is you define how much market you have to reach by virtue of the size of your project. A game like Clickholding is very, very, very niche, but we made it very fast and very cheap, so it doesn't have to reach the same audience as I Am Your Beast or El Paso Elsewhere or any of our larger titles.
Yep.
You can, through precision, define the amount of, you can, through precision, define what space your game has to take up and what will make it a success. And that's something that's been a piece of the studio since the very beginning. When we were making games called An Airport for Aliens, currently run by dogs, and saying, how do we build this entire studio without making it so that someone can't feed their kids because a game like this didn't do well, right?
Yeah, right.
That defined the structure of the studio that I set up from the beginning and how I thought about collaboration. But yeah, principle number one is very much precision in like what the game is and how that then defines what success looks like. And the second thing is being in the industry for a while is really, really nice context because it shows you how often waves and trends are just simply different evolutions of form that people occupy. Especially nowadays, we have arguably as many people like deeply invested in emulation than, and this is a tricky topic, so I'm trying to be very careful how I talk about it, but like the people emulating, the people restoring and preserving games, that scene is thriving. There's more people doing that than ever. Simultaneously, there's more people on Steam than ever. There's more people playing consoles than ever. There's more people playing VR than ever. Everything existing, we're hitting this point culturally where everything exists simultaneously. And if you look at the different waves at the time when VR was really popping off and everyone was like, obviously, VR will be the only thing people play a few years from now. The Kinect. Yeah. I had the opportunity to play with the Kinect again recently. And I was really struck by remembering when even Xbox, with the Xbox One, they made that statement of intent, where it's like that the Kinect sold really well for Xbox 360. It is built in synchronous with the Xbox One experience, which has now not been the case
right.
anymore. The idea that games is always evolving, but also it always leaves space for something, which goes into point one of if it's always leaving space for something, even if you're making something niche, if you make it small enough and cheap enough and with enough heart for your players, you can still make an impact there. Where it inspires me is really just following my creative impulses and the input of my team. There is no one wave or technology or way of playing that I foresee completely supplanting everything else. There will be a Game Boy still playable 100 years from now that some kid, might be an alien kid, picks up from the ashes of civilization, and now they're playing Pokemon. That is games to me. And with that perspective, there will always be value. And I remember when people said that PC was dead, and now PC determines what does well everywhere else. I don't ignore cycles, but I see them for what they are, as distinct cycles in humanity continually saying, this is what it means to be human forever, until the next time that they say, this is what it actually means to be human forever.
How big is your studio? Like, how many people, I guess, in the loop as far as when you're making your games and such?
It changes. It's mainly based off of what each project team is doing and how many people are involved with the game at a given time. But in our constellation model, which I've talked about several times publicly, I'd say that we have anywhere from a little over 100 people who come into projects, do their thing, and come back out. And that number is constantly growing, but it's this rotating cast of collaborators, basically, who, based off of their time and desire and our need and availability, we come together, make something cool, and create the space to do that again later.
You talked about a couple games you've been a publisher and other development. Like, what is that difference like? Obviously, one, you get a little bit more creative leeway, and that's kind of yours, whereas opposed to, you're sort of working with somebody else's vision. Like, how do you sort of meld those minds to where, like, yeah, you're sort of giving them still what it is that they want, while also sort of bringing your own flavor and kind of putting what you bring to the table, bring that to the forefront. Like, what is that like?
It's such a different beast, and it's part of the reason why I end up with a little bit more of a laissez-faire perspective towards what it means to make a game and make a game effectively, and what it means to occupy different pieces of the industry, is because working on 100 games, having been in AAA, been in original IP, being in licensed IP, working in indie, working with publishers / consulting publishers, dealing with executives, interacting with basically every segment of the industry, including the press and influencers, either having interacted with it or been a part of it. It just gives you this really abstracted view where everyone thinks that their circle of the industry is, to a degree, the most important, and has, while it shares some problems with others, it's so filled with the unique problems that no one else can really solve except for the people in this room. And that's just not the case. We are all existing in an ecosystem where a lot of our problems are shared, a lot of our cycles and ideas would simply be improved by looking to our right and our left and seeing what we could learn from the people around us, and talking about the creative difference between publishing and developing. You nailed it right on the head of you're trying to support someone else's vision as opposed to create or impose your own. But the degree to which you can do that is so much defined by, again, the context in which you exist, which is why when I talk to the dozens, if not hundreds of people every year that ask me, like, what should I do now? What is games like? I've been in the industry for 20 plus years. I've done pretty much everything. I don't really know what I need next. So much of what I do and trying to give back by talking to those folks and making space for it is say, well, what life do you want to live? Because you can see what life you're going to live 3 years from now by the conditions you set up today. You can know by virtue of one clause in your publishing contract what it's going to look like to interact with the developer 3 games from now, 8 games from now. Yes, every game is unique, but also in so many cases, every game and every team isn't unique. It is simply permutations of the everlasting question, how do we make an amazing experience for players and get them coming back for the next one? So that's a long and rambling answer, but the short one is, yes, the approach is different, but it's also very shared in my mind of being a philosophical and conditions-based one. If you change your process, you change your project. And that is just as true on the development side as it is on the publishing side.
Since you have been in the industry a long while, like just give everybody a rundown of the projects you've worked on. Obviously your projects, some of the other projects that people would recognize. Just sort of give us a rundown of the stuff you've worked on.
That's a challenging one. Magic the Gathering, Hypnospace Outlaw, We're the Caretakers, Angry Beast, El Paso Elsewhere, Space Warlord, Organ Trading Simulator, an Airport for Aliens Currently Run by Dogs, Life Eater, Witch Strandings, No Way Home, which just got resurrected in a roguelike form, Reigns Beyond, Stranger Things VR, South Park Snow Day. As I'm running through this list in my head, I'm also trying to figure out which ones I can talk about and or are still under NDA.
Yeah.
I worked on Superliminal back in the day, back when it had a very different name. It's a long, long list.
You got your games and stuff like that, but then what mediums are you sort of looking to branch out into outside of that? Obviously, you've kind of done a lot of things, but I kind of touched on like the comic book feel of some of your projects. Like, so I'm guessing that comic books is sort of a part of inspiration as a part of there as well. Like, what other mediums are you sort of looking at, thinking about? Is there a potential you're working on any projects outside of, just strictly the gaming medium?
It's a mixture of two things. I still want to exist in as many spaces as possible. So I have now written for comics professionally, which is really cool considering how big of an impact they had on me as a teenager. I didn't grow up reading comics. I was one of those homeschool kids who was like, oh, I don't read books with pictures. Yeah. It's only unabridged classics for me. Yeah. When I started getting into comics and had started my journey of stripping off some of my pretension, I suddenly had my eyes open to all of the things they were doing creatively, philosophically, how that interacted with the business of comics, yada, 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 and created an entire new piece of my brain. Just like added one on, like a big old cyberpunk augmentation. And in that regard, I think continuing to still operate in different spaces with other collaborators and environments is exciting. El Paso Elsewhere is getting made into a film right now, being adapted by D. Bonaventura Pictures and Lakeith Stanfield, and interacting with that process. That feels like another way in which my brain is changing and growing, and who knows, there might be more for me to do in the field of film and TV down the road. Having this broader artistic perspective that lets me move other places is still really exciting. But I think combined with that is also a real recognition of what makes me happy and what I need. And a lot of it is doing exactly what I am now for as long as God gives me the ability to do so. I'm not necessarily looking to become giant Hollywood film producer, at least at this point. I know that making games that are exciting and artful with intentional constraints brings my heart joy. And so setting up the conditions of my studio and hopefully the collaborations with my collaborators and the conditions of my life, like how frugally me and my family live, setting that all up so that we can be happy and just build these small, compelling worlds over and over again for as long as we can. That's where my head is at. You've activated my trap card, so my apologies on some of the ramble here. It's something I've been thinking about a lot in terms of I've done so many things in games. I don't have the dreams I had when I was a kid. I don't need to stand up on an E3 stage to be happy. If it happens, as a matter of course of pursuing the actual day-to-day that I love and enjoy in which I can empower others, I'll be up on the E3 stage and I'll have a good time. But a lot of my dreams are either things I've accomplished or they are things that I can now look at critically and say would not satisfy my soul. So I'm in my era of defining, of carving out my garden and nurturing it rather than attempting to conquer new worlds.
It's dope. Plug yourself and, just let us know what you got going on currently and possibly here in the nearest future here.
So for those of you not following Scaffold already, my studio, which made quite a few of the games I referred to, Iron Beast, El Paso Elsewhere, Space Warlord, Organ Trading Simulator, following us at Strange Scaffold is something I'd recommend. At Strange Scaffold everywhere. One of the things that we make as part of our core is we have what we call the Strange Scaffold collection. Okay. Whenever you buy, if you buy that and you have all of our games, when our next game comes out, you don't just get the launch discount, you get another large discount on top of that to incentivize you to come on this journey with us and see what wild thing we make next. You can follow me at Rit Nelson everywhere if you want to see me talk in a more personal way about all that cool stuff we're doing. The next immediate future is really, really weird and exciting. So look for a big announcement from us, as well as a co-op kaiju horror cooking game, as well as a match 3. Well, originally the way we described it was a match 3 survival horror comedy RPG. But now what I think the most accurate description is a Metroidvania, is a match 3 Metroidvania in a survival horror setting with the language of RPGs called Creepy Redneck Dinosaur Mansion 3. You can expect that next year.
All right.